Hello and welcome to India's Eye. India and the US have concluded their first ever 2+2 dialogue. On September 6th, US Defense Secretary James Mattis and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo held talks with Indian External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj and Defense Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. The focus of the dialogue was on defense cooperation, strategic ties in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, increasing bilateral trade, investment, innovation, job creation, and the implementation of the civil nuclear cooperation between the two countries. To discuss the outcome of this highest level structured dialogue between the two countries, we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Kamal Sibal, one of our most eminent diplomats. He was Foreign Secretary of India, an ambassador to Russia, France, Egypt and Turkey. We have with us Mr. Bharat Karnad, a distinguished strategic analyst. He is Professor of National Security Studies at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. His fascinating book, Staggering Forward, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition, has just been published last week. And we have with us Commodore Uday Bhaskar, another distinguished strategic analyst. He is currently the Director of Society for Policy Studies, an independent think tank based in New Delhi. Earlier he headed the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis and the National Maritime Foundation. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let me begin with you. Would you tell us briefly what have been the most important outcomes of this 2+2 dialogue? And did the twice postponed dialogue live up to its hype?
Well, the fact that it was twice postponed is neither here nor there. The fact that it is being held is important. For an American Secretary of State and an American Defense Secretary to come together and talk to their counterparts in India is in itself politically a very important and significant event, because it sends signals all around in the region and globally about US and India deciding to consolidate and deepen their strategic partnership. And I think the message will be heard the loudest in China and Pakistan, because these are the two countries which are our adversaries. They cooperate with each other, and in different ways they are huge problems for the Americans. That is one aspect. The other is with regard to the hype. I don't think that this 2+2 dialogue was intended to break such dramatic new ground that would push the relationship into a new orbit altogether. This can't happen. This has to be a slow process, an incremental process where you build greater trust with each other, because even now when we have stronger India-US ties, there is a big element of distrust, and if it's not distrust, uncertainty in the relationship, and not only on account of what Trump is and his unpredictable policies, but there are two issues on which we have big problems, and on this we have not had any clarity at this dialogue, which is relations with Russia, relations with Iran, CAATSA sanctions, and today we are not very clear whether we will get a proper waiver on either of these two problems that we face. And very briefly, with regard to other issues, I was told that COMCASA may not be ready for signature, although negotiations had advanced very rapidly and Americans were being very accommodative in terms of fashioning something which met our requirements. But I'm a bit surprised that the whole thing got accelerated and we were able to sign that. Though of course this hype that is going to release all sorts of defense technologies to us, I think is a bit misplaced, because it only relates to communication equipment and not the in general transfer of sensitive technologies to India. On Indo-Pacific, they have stated what we all already know in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative without mentioning it. There is a strong allusion to that. On defense issues in general, I think there are building blocks that have been put in place to expand the defense relationship, whether it is tri-services exercise or cooperation between the Indian Navy and NAVCENT for the Western Indian Ocean, which was a bit of a gap in our Indo-Pacific strategy. And with regard to the industry security annex, which would be necessary if the two industries were to begin cooperating, and in the context of Make in India in defense manufacturing. So there are areas in which, but all this is a work in progress, because if we don't get satisfaction on Russia and Iran, I think that will be a huge setback
Okay.
to the relationship and might therefore make the progress in strengthening our so-called strategic partnership that much more difficult.
Okay. So that we've got an overview of what was achieved. Bharat, my question to you is that the signing of COMCASA, Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement. Now with the signing of COMCASA, we've signed 3 of the 4 foundational agreements. The other 2 being General Security or Military Information Agreement and LEMOA, Logistics Exchange Memorandum Agreement of 2016. Now what specifically is India going to gain from signing these agreements? I remember you writing recently that if the BJP government signs COMCASA, it means it is capitulated before the US. Would you care to elaborate?
Oh, absolutely. But before I do, can I just say that the 2 postponements of the 2+2 or 2 into 2, whatever however you care to designate the talks, were because the US was not sure that they would get the COMCASA. By the time this thing rolled around is when Washington was certain that, or were given indication that in fact the Cabinet Committee on Security would actually pass it, would okay it and it be approved and the whole thing would go forward. That's the reason why I think we got the talks that we did. COMCASA is going to do, first of all, what it does is, as I've said before, it permits the United States military and intelligence agencies to horizontally and vertically penetrate the entire Indian communications grid, the entire secret grid, including the command control links to the Strategic Forces Command. Once they have that, they have the override capacity, whether or not it will ever be acknowledged by India or the United States, into doing all kinds of things by way of mischief. And now that's the worst case. It's true, but that is the potential that is now in American hands and that you've legally given them. As I think Ambassador Kanwal has mentioned, it is not a carte blanche in terms of accessing American technology. It's nothing of the kind. All it does is provide not even the frontline equipment, communications equipment on our P-8Is and the C-17s and the C-130Js that we have bought from the United States. What it does is it gives you a level of interface, operable interface, with the American systems and weapons platforms. Yeah. So this is all that it does. But what it gives away is an awful lot, as I've just mentioned, in terms of penetrability and in terms of giving the Americans access to our most classified communications network.
Commodore Uday Bhaskar, you are a Navy man. So with COMCASA, apparently the Navy stands to gain because this P-8I maritime aircraft, they don't have apparently something called Data Link 11 and Data Link 16, which are sort of sensitive systems, which now will be given to the Indian Navy. Similarly, in the context of air platforms, they say that precision GPS gear, state-of-the-art guidance systems for this combat version of Sea Guardian drones will come now. So what you were getting was stripped-down technology. Now you'll get the kind of technology that COMCASA signatories get. Now, how important are these communication systems for the Navy? Was the lack of these communication systems making these aircraft or these platforms less efficient?
I think that's a good way of describing it, that the current arrangement without the COMCASA, take the P-8 aircraft alone, it's a maritime reconnaissance aircraft, it also has an anti-submarine capability. Without the COMCASA, we were operating in a less than optimum manner, as opposed to less than efficient manner, meaning that this aircraft with its full surveillance kit would have been capable of delivering, say, at a raised to the power of 3 in terms of the anti-submarine capability and the surveillance and the maritime domain awareness. Without COMCASA, we are operating at, say, a raised to the power of just 1, meaning A. You could double it by having access to greater information on the grid. You refer to Data Link 11, etc. So there is a clear tactical advantage on specific platforms. This is about the MR aircraft, the maritime reconnaissance. Similarly, for the transport aircraft, if you're going to be up in the air for 12 to 14 hours, it makes sense to be able to use your communication equipment to optimum depending on whatever. These are very basic kind of, shall we say, advantages. But allow me to disagree with Bharat. The suggestion that by India signing COMCASA, you automatically allow the Americans access to your strategic forces, communication and command, I would submit most earnestly is not valid. Are the Americans capable of entering any country's strategic communication grid? Perhaps they may be attempting it in a covert way. COMCASA is not related. After all, in the Cold War, the Russians and the Americans invested enormous amounts of funds and technology to see what kind of surveillance they could do on the other. That's a completely different ballgame. But I would just suggest that there are various ways of looking at this. The armed forces of India have done their homework. They are aware of what kind of, shall we say, cost-benefit analysis is there in this, and they have gone into this with their eyes open. So I just want to say that there is another view. We are not opening.
But the armed forces were earlier opposed to COMCASA precisely on the grounds that
I know, but not on strategic forces. This I want to say very clearly. On this program, to suggest that India is giving up its strategic forces, shall we say, the sanctity, would I would submit very earnestly is a misnomer.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that for the time being. Let me ask you a slightly different question. See, one of the advantages of COMCASA that is being presented to us is that there will be interoperability between the US military and the Indian military. Now, I have been wondering that in which theatre, against which adversary, and under what circumstances do we expect Indian and military, US military forces to operate together? And if you look at the past, have there been instances, a single instance, where we've lost out because we didn't have interoperability with the American military, and therefore we were at a great disadvantage? Because then we can talk about in future we will get certain advantage out of this.
Look, one is putting technologies in place which will permit interoperability. Yeah. The other is actually taking political decisions whether we are going to participate together in operations.
So, but you are preparing the basis for that, right?
No, not necessarily. Okay, you can say you are preparing the basis, but the ultimate decision whether you are going to actually participate jointly with America in any operation is a political decision. If tomorrow, for example, the United States through COMCASA wants us to take action against Iran, we will certainly refuse. Or do something with regard to Russian naval presence in the Indian Ocean, we will certainly refuse. But if it comes to the Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean, certainly we will be open to cooperation. Now, the thing with a couple of things I want to say. One is that I have had intensive discussions with the top brass of the Indian Armed Forces on COMCASA. And I get the impression that whatever reservations, whatever concerns they had were put on the table, and they presented their drafts to the Americans for consideration. And according to them, the Americans were very accommodative, and they agreed to whatever we wanted in terms of something different than the thing they sign usually with other countries. That is one. The other is that earlier on, the fear that was expressed was that this communication system, American, will be put on all Indian platforms. Now it is only restricted to US supplied military platforms. Now, here the advantage would be that if you have direct communications, you have real-time transfer of information with regard to whatever the potential security issues are. Otherwise, it will take time. Now, you can't operate in an area if you are not getting real-time information. If, for example, the Chinese submarines are entering into the Indian Ocean and P8I are sort of monitoring that, so the Americans have their own way of monitoring, and they can pass you the information so that you can track their movement in the Indian Ocean. These are some of the...
But suppose they don't, like they did not pass on information about 2611, which they had.
Then COMCASA will not work. Yeah. It will not work.
So we are still at the mercy of the Americans as far as interoperability or sharing of communication.
No, but it's in their interest, since they want also to now counter the Chinese naval rise of the Chinese naval assets and their entry into the Indian Ocean. It is in their interest.
I don't want to push it, but then clearly interoperability will depend only when the US is willing. Otherwise, there is no interoperability. So only when their interests are involved is interoperability. When our interests are there, they may refuse.
No, in that case, of course, it will become a huge handicap for them in terms of India acquiring additional equipment and agreeing to certain other conditions that the Americans may lay down, because then we'll say, look, what we have agreed to in writing, you are not honoring. Okay. So what's the point, therefore, going further in this direction with you with no guarantee that you will actually honor what you have signed with us on paper? Okay. So I think one shouldn't think of the worst case scenario. But let me also say one thing, that we insisted that the Americans will not have the right to inspect this system that they are giving us in our military bases and this and that all that will be centralized in New Delhi, because the keys have to be changed every month or every whatever it is, and this will be done in a highly centralized manner so that they do not get intrusive rights into our military deployments and everything else.
Do you want to say something on Comcasa, or shall I ask you a different question?
No, let me just say something on Comcasa, then you can ask me the other question. Comcasa is this. The problem with Comcasa, as I see it, is this. While it's true that formally the American communications gear is on board Indian aircraft that we buy from the US and so on, platforms that we buy from the US are restricted to those platforms. The fact though is that these are conventionally linked to other platforms that we have that are sourced from other countries, right? Now, how are we going to deal with the Russians saying, once you've given that link to the, if you want to have just the exclusive American link, it's not possible, because what India also wants and has built in is a grid that also involves weapons platforms from other countries, sourced from other countries. How do you then ensure that the Russian Akula 2s, for instance, which is, by the way,
10 minutes, may I explain how?
Not 10 minutes. Not 10 minutes. You have a minute.
But let me just finish. Let me just finish this. The Russian Akula 2s is a sore point with the Russians. Surely that can be granted. That has been put on the table by the Russians to say this is going to, in a sense, compromise their weapons platforms, and they'll have to very seriously then rethink the entire Akula lease business, right? And that's the reason why the negotiations with the second Akula are on ice right now. Nothing's happening, because they want to see how it's going to progress. Now that we have gone ahead and signed the Comcasa, what happens to the acquisitions of a really front-end kind that the Russians are going to give us? Because it's not anything that the Americans will ever provide you.
Okay, Commodore, what happens to Akula, the second Akula?
No, I don't want to second guess the Akula, because how the Russians are going to react as far as the Indian, shall we say, partnership with the United States is a completely different kind of subject, which has many other considerations. And I think India is fully aware it did not get into Comcasa without taking into account what would be the likely impact on Moscow, because it is true, India has a very deep relationship with Moscow, and our strategic programs, including the nuclear submarine, have been enabled to considerable measure by our cooperation. So obviously India is not going to jettison or not take that into account. I don't want to get into the Akula, it's a complex subject, but I want to again disabuse this notion that India or the Indian Navy or the Indian military, let me put it that way, is unaware of either network-centric vulnerabilities or the need to have firewalls. This is a complex subject technically, it's been studied in great detail, definitely, as far as I know the Navy.
I take your word.
But I want to pick up what Ambassador Sybil said. One of the things, the anxiety about Comcasa in the past, in the public domain particularly, was the so-called surprise inspection. Now, this is true that if a country signs what was called as the SISMOA, which is what the Americans have with their allies, they have the right to carry out surprise inspections on their allies' military bases. That is more to check out their preparedness, protocols, etc. We are not in that league. There is no surprise element, and as he said, India has ensured that the equipment would be monitored or regulated in a pre-planned manner.
Okay,
just one thing.
We're really running out of time.
Just one minute. Just 1 minute. Most of these American systems, incidentally, and perhaps Bhaskar is aware, as is the ambassador, have remote possibilities of monitoring. They don't need to have the end user in terms of their being at the station of use. They can remotely monitor, and they all have this capability, and the Americans will monitor. So whether or not someone certifies that your end station is not relevant to the debate we are having.
But Bharat, on this, you buy equipment from anyone, Moscow, Beijing, Israel, you can make the same case and say there is a secret chip.
We'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. We also had a secret chip in the 2000 rupee note, which you have not found as
We have a secret chip here.
Ambassador Sybil, have we firewalled our defense agreements with Russia? For example, take the case of the S-400 Triumph missile system. Is it India's calculation that we'll keep the Americans busy, keep them happy by signing all these basic agreements, etc., in the hope that they'll say, all right, you go ahead and buy the Russian system instead of the Patriot missile defense system? Is there that faint hope that if we do this with the Americans, maybe they'll let us off on the Russians?
The problem is a bit different. One is that we have told the Americans are accepting this argument that the S-400 negotiations began several years ago, and they have reached a point where we can sign the agreement. And therefore, there is no reason why the S-400 should be targeted by CAATSA. I think at the end of the day, and it's been made very clear by our defense minister and others, that we are going to go ahead with S-400, because if we don't, that would create a huge rupture in our relationship with Russia. I'm personally convinced we'll go ahead with S-400 no matter what the Americans do.
Despite American sanctions?
Despite American sanctions. Problem is twofold. One is that this wretched waiver that has been given by the US Congress is only for 6 months. Now this is a handle which has been given to President Trump to demand every 6 months, please show that you have reduced your arms purchases from Russia and that you have increased your arms purchases from the United States. Now this is blackmail, and this they will use to the hilt. Yeah. The other thing with this is that the Russians, our relationship with Russia cannot be at the mercy of what the US laws are or anything else, and therefore we would lose a great deal of our foreign policy posture, our strategic autonomy, our independence of foreign policy, if on an issue like this we yielded ground and accepted the last point is that assuming that the Americans decide that they have to sanction India, then the rest of what they are doing with us in terms of building a defense relationship will begin to slowly erode and in fact come virtually to a standstill. So it's a big risk that they are taking, and I don't think they will be foolish enough to actually put a huge brake on what they actually want to achieve in terms of a defense partnership with India for a variety of reasons by targeting us on S-400.
Okay, so Bharat, on the one hand we say that we want to preserve our strategic autonomy vis-a-vis Russia, or even vis-a-vis Iran in importing oil from them and building the Chabahar port. On the other hand, you are actually eroding your strategic autonomy by signing all these foundational agreements and in effect basically saying that look, we are going to be sourcing our weapon systems from you largely.
Yes, absolutely. As I've said, the meta strategic objective of the United States is essentially to crowd out the Russians as the main military supplier, and there's no doubt about it. Except they'll never offer you for love, money or shared democratic values any of the frontline equipment of the kind that the Russians routinely give us access to, like the attack submarine, the nuclear-powered attack submarines. Is anybody reasonably arguing that that's the kind of stuff that the Americans will give us? They don't even give it to their treaty allies, for God's sake. Now, that's the kind of conceit we have, that somehow we are more special than the treaty allies. But that's the kind of disillusion that I think we are headed for. The second thing I think is this. I think Ambassador Kanwal used the word blackmail, and it's very apt. Why? Because they essentially are having a Damocles' sword hanging over our necks, saying, well, look, it's a case-by-case waiver. Now, S-400, yes, they'll give us a waiver because that's not a big deal. What happens the next time around for other things that we might want? And by the way, the S-400 is the best system for air defense in the world. Because Ashley Tellis pulls so much weight in India and by the Indian establishment, including the military, maybe they should read what Ashley Tellis has said about the NASAM-2, saying it doesn't compare with S-400. So this is the kind of stuff you're getting into. Now, if they're going to perennially hold the waiver sanctions over your head, what does that make you except hostage to their interests? And lastly, is this the best negotiating tactic that the Indian government applied in dealing with the Americans? Shouldn't they have waited for permanent waiver? How they manage is your goddamn business. You get us the permanent waiver on anything we do vis-a-vis Iran and Russia, or we don't sign anything with you. You're in a position to dictate. You don't exercise any of your imperatives, and then you squawk about this, that, and the other. After things happen, the things will erode. Who gives a damn once you've signed the thing? It's like one thing. It's like the nuclear deal, where we say we have the freedom to test again. You're never going to exercise that freedom once you've signed it away.
Okay, so
Just
a minute. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question.
Let me ask you. But can I just say a quick word?
No, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. My question is, on the one hand, you have these criticisms that Bharat Karnataka is making. On the other hand, we are talking of very big things like strategic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Now, suppose all the other defense things fall through because we insist on strategic autonomy, then what happens to strategic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific? Already, do you think more energy is being spent by the Trump administration in trying to wean away North Korea from China than on strengthening Indo-Pacific cooperation with ASEAN at the center of it, as we are claiming?
See, there are three things. Let me go backwards. As far as Mr. Trump and his priorities are concerned, it's very clear that he's erratic, he's uncertain. Yeah. We don't know what will be tomorrow's tweet. So it is true that he had prioritized North Korea at one point, so much so that the 2+2 that had been planned earlier got postponed, primarily because of the prioritization and the Secretary of State had to go there. That's a separate basket altogether. But on strategic autonomy, Bharat, very quickly, I must say this because Bharat Karnataka is sitting here, that you can sit here and say, God damn this and God damn that and strategic autonomy, why don't we get permanent waivers? But that's not the real world. India has vulnerabilities, which is why we are dependent on Moscow to a great extent. We have now started a supply chain with the United States and with Israel. Bharat, strategic autonomy, we are talking about a country where you don't produce a rifle, you don't produce a personal weapon, your rupee dollar is plummeting. So to suggest that you can sit here in a studio and tick off the whole world doesn't make sense. Your choices and options are very limited. I believe the PMO, whether led by Prime Minister Modi or previously by Dr. Manmohan Singh, has thought through all these things. They are not as binary as is being made out.
So Bharat is a great strategic analyst, but he's out of touch with reality and doesn't know anything. But that's between the two of you. That's between the two of you. You settle it outside the studio. But my last question to you, sir, is on Afghanistan. The two sides have said that there should be an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace and reconciliation process. But yet you have America unilaterally negotiating with the Taliban. The intelligence officers of US, Russia, China and Iran met in Islamabad in the first week of July and probably are working out some peace agreements. How are we going to ensure that Indian interests are protected in Afghanistan?
In fact, when I looked through the joint statement, I concluded that the weakest part of the joint statement is Afghanistan. Because nothing new has been said, no explanation has been given as to what the long-term or medium-term policy of the United States is with regard to Afghanistan. And in fact, all the progress that we made in terms of our presence in Afghanistan and the goodwill that we have earned will be jeopardized by the uncertainty that American policies are generating with regard to the Taliban. They've had direct conversations with them. And Pakistan will again become useful to them. And they have approached Pakistan to facilitate a talk with the Taliban. So I'm afraid that on Afghanistan and generally speaking, even with regard to Pakistan, notwithstanding all that is there about terrorism, because a rehash of what has been said earlier, there is still a divergence between us and the United States with regard to Pakistan and Afghanistan and the general situation to the west of us. To the east of us, of course, there's better convergence. So I'm afraid I would agree with you that on Afghanistan, the Americans are not being very clear with us as to what their longer term strategy is and how they would help us to protect our interests there.
Okay, we've really run out of time. We could go on for another half an hour, but I'd like to thank all of you, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Bharat Karnataka, Ambassador Kanwal Sibul, for participating in this interesting discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week. Until then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's Eye.